He stood in the middle of the corridor, while the fluorescent lights flickered like a heartbeat fading in the dark. Outside the doors, the storm raged, shaking the hospital windows. And behind him, a group of foreign specialists whispered the same sentence they had repeated all day. "That Filipino won't be able to fix it. Not tonight. Not something this big." They didn't whisper because they feared he would hear it. They whispered because they believed it. Yet there he was, this quiet man from the Philippines, his uniform slightly damp from the rain, his hand still carrying the warmth of tools he refused to put down. His name was Marco Reyes, and they said he was just a maintenance technician. A small role, a background worker, someone who should have stayed out of the crisis. Because in that European hospital, when something advanced, delicate, and vital collapsed, something that controlled the power supply for an entire building, no one expected a Filipino to be the one called in, and certainly not the one to solve it. A few meters away, two senior engineers shook their heads over a pile of manuals and failed diagnostics. One of them pushed aside a folder, frustrated. "This system is too complex. He'll never understand it. Their training is different where he's from." Where he's from, as if the Philippines existed only in postcards, beaches, and stereotypes. Marco heard it. He always heard it. For years abroad, he had learned to walk through comments like these, letting them touch him but never break him. Still, tonight felt different, because this wasn't about him anymore. It was the ICU, the neonatal ward. The life support machines already running on borrowed time. And as he stepped closer to the failing control room, another voice cut through the dim hallway. "Let the experts handle it. He'll just slow us down." It wasn't the words that made the moment sharp. It was the certainty behind them. But as the generator sputtered again, an electric gasp, almost like a cry, his eyes narrowed with a calmness none of them had. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a quiet understanding deeper than any manual they carried. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone underestimated finally decides to stop shrinking? Because that was the moment Marco inhaled slowly, looked at the blinking alarm system, and whispered, almost to himself, "I know this language." No one believed him. Not yet. The storm outside intensified, casting shadows across the corridor as if nature itself was watching. The foreign engineers stood frozen, unsure whether to mock him again or step aside. But something in Marco's posture, steady, collected, unafraid, made them hesitate. And that hesitation was the beginning. Because as he gently opened the metal panel, revealing the maze of circuits inside, a question began to form in every mind present. Uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and undeniable. Had they been wrong about Filipinos all along? No one knew then that the answer to that question would unfold before sunrise. He reached for his tools. They held their breath. And the real test, the one that would rewrite their beliefs, was about to begin. They didn't know the weight he carried long before this night. To them, he was simply the Filipino technician, a label spoken with polite smiles but quiet doubt. And inside that European hospital, years of old beliefs lingered in the hallways like forgotten dust. Beliefs that said real engineering came only from the West. That precision was born in big universities. That brilliance had an accent they were familiar with. The Philippines, in their minds, was warm beaches and gentle people, not sharpened skill or technical mastery. That prejudice didn't need shouting. It lived in the subtle things, how they handed him the simplest tasks, how they double-checked everything he touched, how they spoke slower when giving instructions, as if English suddenly became fragile in his ears. And Marco felt it most painfully on his first month there. The supervisor nodded at him with a distant smile and said, "We don't usually assign critical systems to foreign hires. Don't take it personally." But you and I both know that "don't take it personally" is exactly where the wound begins. Tonight, under the trembling lights of the failing hospital, those wounds resurfaced. He remembered the first time they laughed, not cruelly, but with disbelief, when he fixed a circuit issue in half the expected time. One engineer whispered, "Beginner's luck." Another added, "He probably guessed." In those moments, he learned something. When people do not expect much from you, even your excellence looks like coincidence to them. He once stood in a training session where they explained the hospital's power schematic as if he had never seen a circuit board before. One instructor even said, "These systems are advanced. Don't feel bad if you struggle. People from smaller countries often do." Marco only nodded, but inside, something quiet stirred. A mixture of humility and an ache that Filipinos know too well, an ache born from being unseen even while standing in full view. Still, he watched. He memorized. He studied every wire, every relay, every backup circuit they dismissed him from operating. He learned the architecture of that hospital not because they asked him to, but because he was Filipino. And Filipinos have a way of preparing even when no one believes preparation matters. But what they didn't know was the life he lived before setting foot here. He came from a provincial hospital in the Philippines, a place where one wrong connection could plunge entire wards into darkness, and where technicians like him didn't have manuals. Only instinct, experience, and the pressure of knowing lives depended on their hands. Back home, he had repaired systems older than he was, machines patched together through ingenuity rather than luxury. When you grow up fixing the impossible, the word complex loses its power. That truth followed him tonight, as he stepped deeper into the control room, with the air turning heavier and the hum of the emergency power narrowing into a strained whisper. The foreign engineers stood behind him, arms crossed, waiting. Some expecting his failure, others simply curious about how quickly it would happen. A silence formed. Not peaceful, expectant, like the world holding its breath before judging him again. Then an alarm beeped sharply. Red lights blinked across the panel. A system test was about to initiate automatically, one that would expose every flaw in the power grid and determine if the hospital would survive the next hour. The room froze. Every eye turned to him, to the man they believed would fail first. He placed his hand on the panel, steady and unshaken. And the moment the test began, they waited. Not for him to succeed, but for him to crumble. But deep inside, something else had begun to rise. A quiet certainty, a Filipino certainty, and it was only moments away from revealing itself. The first alarm tone hadn't even finished echoing when Marco leaned closer to the open panel, his eyes narrowing as if he were reading a language the others had never learned. The foreign engineers watched, puzzled by his stillness. They expected panic, frantic movements, the shaking hands of a man overwhelmed. Instead, they saw something that unsettled them more than failure ever could. Calm confidence. It began with a single gesture. He gently traced one of the wires with his fingertip, following its path as though it were part of a story he already knew. The room quieted, not because he asked for silence, but because the moment itself demanded it. There was a precision in the way he moved, a steadiness shaped not by textbooks, but by years of working where errors were unforgiving. One engineer whispered, "What is he doing?" Another replied, "He's guessing." But the truth was far simpler. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering. A soft click sounded as he adjusted a relay others had ignored. The tone of the power flow shifted. Subtle, nearly imperceptible, but enough to make even the senior specialist stop mid-breath. They had dismissed that relay earlier, called it irrelevant. But Marco saw what they missed. A small fluctuation, barely measurable, but enough to weaken the entire grid if left unchecked. He stepped back for a moment, eyes scanning the diagnostic screen as though the numbers were responding to him directly. The silence grew heavier, thicker, as if the entire hospital leaned closer. And then, with a movement so simple it felt almost disrespectful to the complexity they believed in, he reached into his kit and pulled out a tool they hardly recognized. It wasn't the brand they used. It wasn't sleek or imported. It was worn, the grip softened by time, a tool that had survived typhoons, power surges, and nights far hotter than this European winter. The head engineer frowned. "That's outdated. That won't work here." But Marco didn't answer. Filipinos don't always defend themselves with words. Sometimes they speak through outcome. He tightened one connection, loosened another, rewired a small section with a technique no one in that room had seen before. Precise, yet improvised, methodical, yet flexible. It was the kind of skill born where resources are thin and creativity becomes a form of survival. The laughter that once filled the corridor had fully disappeared now. No one moved. No one dared interrupt. When he straightened his posture again, his expression was unreadable, not triumphant, not boastful, just sure. And that was the moment the shift truly began. The senior engineer leaned forward, his eyebrows tightening. "Wait, how did he know that?" Another whispered, softer this time. "That configuration. It shouldn't work, but it does." Their disbelief was no longer mocking. It was awakening. The diagnostic screen flickered again. Once, twice, and then stabilized in a pattern none of them had been able to achieve through hours of attempts. The red indicators dimmed to amber. The alarm softened. A fragile balance returned to the machinery. For the first time since the crisis began, the room felt like it could breathe. But Marco wasn't finished. He reached for a final switch, one they had all avoided because activating it too early could collapse the entire system. His fingers paused above it, as if listening to something only he could hear, and with the gentlest pressure, he pushed it forward. The room lights steadied. The machines hummed in unison. The system recognized itself again. It wasn't a full victory, not yet. But it was the spark. A spark that made the loudest skeptic step closer, unable to hide the shock in his voice. How did he do that? The answer was simple, though none of them could grasp it fully. Not yet. Because he hadn't even revealed his strongest skill. And the moment he did, everything would change. The spark he created should have been impossible. At least that was what the specialists believed. Yet there it was. Numbers on the diagnostic screen aligning with a steadiness that hadn't appeared all night. The power grid was stabilizing, but only barely. It was like watching a wounded patient take the first steady breath after hours of struggling. But everyone knew the real test was still coming. The head engineer stepped forward, voice tight. "If the main breaker fails again, the ICU loses power. There won't be a second backup. We can't afford a mistake now." The unspoken message was clear. If the Filipino takes the next step, he carries the weight of every life inside this hospital. Marco didn't look at them when he answered. "I know." He walked toward the heart of the system, the master breaker room, where the outage had begun. It was a place no one wanted to touch since the failure started. A wrong move here, a single miscalibration, and the entire building could fall into complete darkness. The corridor leading there felt colder, narrower. The storm outside roared against the walls as if nature itself were pounding for attention. But Marco moved slowly, almost deliberately, as though every step was part of a silent prayer. When he reached the main panel, the truth revealed itself. 2 major lines were overheating. If they went critical, the hospital would shut down instantly. The foreign engineers stared, pale and unsure. One whispered, "We should call the central technicians. This is beyond us." Another said, "This system isn't built for manual correction. It's too dangerous." Marco ran his hand across the wires, not touching, just feeling the heat radiating from them. He had seen failures like this before, not in Europe, but in the Philippines, where hospitals sometimes survived on patched systems and sheer human determination. Back home, he had worked in places where power outages didn't ask for permission. They simply came. And people like him had learned to fight darkness with skill, instinct, and the kind of courage no certification could measure. He took a breath, then another, and then he began. He shut off one auxiliary line with a rapid precision that made the specialists flinch. Next, he rerouted a circuit manually. Something the manual said was not recommended. Something the engineers said was impossible. Something Marco had done dozens of times in small provincial hospitals, where impossibility was a luxury they could never afford. The breaker hissed. Sparks cracked. The lights flickered once more, as if reconsidering whether to abandon the building. And then, with a movement sharp and decisive, he performed a cross-line reinforcement that none of the specialists recognized. It was a technique learned through years of experience and necessity, a Filipino adaptation, not written in any manual, but proven in reality. A heavy silence fell. The machines held their breath. The hospital waited. Then, a deep, steady hum rose from the system. The overheating lights dimmed, then cooled. The power grid locked into perfect sync. The ICU monitors brightened. The neonatal machine steadied. The emergency hallways glowed fully for the first time that night. The entire hospital had been saved in one impossible moment. The head engineer stepped back, eyes wide, disbelief melting slowly into awe. The older technician, once the loudest critic, lowered his head, not in shame but in quiet recognition. He whispered, "We misjudged you. We misjudged your people." Another voice followed, trembling slightly. "If this is how Filipinos work, the world has much to learn." Marco didn't smile. He didn't boast. He simply exhaled. A long, gentle release of everything he carried. Because the victory was never about proving them wrong. It was about protecting every patient who slept through the storm, unaware that a man they underestimated had just fought for their lives in silence. And in that silence, something larger was born. A story no longer belonging to one technician, but to an entire nation that had been doubted too many times, yet rose again and again with quiet, unshakable strength. And as the storm outside softened, a new truth settled over everyone present, one they would never forget. Sometimes the hero you least expect is the Filipino standing quietly in the corner, ready to save the world when no one else can.